Hey there, this is Sean Murphy with 1455. Welcome back to our monthly author series where we take an in-depth, deep dive into a particular author's work. As has been noted, these are typically handled live at our local Hanley Library here in Winchester. Due to current events, we have moved these to Zoom. And we're having a lot of fun with this format, and it's a good test drive for our literary festival, which is coming up in July, more of which later. But for today, I'm really excited to welcome a friend and writer, Chris Register. It's always wonderful as someone that writes, not only runs, but writes about an organization. Our mission statement is to celebrate creativity and cultivate community. And the theme of our literary festival this year is storytelling. But storytelling and writing is such a solitary endeavor, and we finally have somebody who not only has a lot of stories to tell, but has gotten outside of the proverbial office to go and find those stories. So there's going to be a lot of fun things to hear and talk about. So let me introduce Chris and his book project, and then we'll bring him on to read from that, and we'll have a nice discussion. Chris Register served in the Peace Corps, graduated from Georgetown Law, and litigated cases in the U.S. District Court before undertaking this project, Conversations with Us. This 50-state, 16,000-mile bicycling exploration of America now invites readers to ride along and connect the landscapes and people of our shared nation. This project is grounded in the notion that there must be more to America than the typical refrain offered by politicians and cable news pundits that we're a nation divided. It's being at odds with one another really what defines us? Or is there another side to America, a common thread running along the Mississippi River and over the Rocky Mountains, connecting city streets with gravel farm roads? Readers can decide for themselves after meeting hundreds of Americans who shared their thoughts and stories with this author, Chris Register, as he pedaled a loaded touring bicycle some 16,000 miles across the USA. Chris, welcome to this conversation, and let me begin by saying 16,000 miles, you are without a doubt the first author I've talked to who's tracked 16,000 miles on a bike. So congratulations, and I'm in awe of you.
Thank you, Sean. Some people just say I'm crazy, so I appreciate that. First of all, I want to say thanks for having me in your author series. I appreciate it. And I definitely, I attended the Literary Festival last year. I'm looking forward to virtually attending this year. And I just want to just say thanks to you and everyone who works with 1455 and all the donors who keep it running as well, and volunteers for what you guys are doing for writers and by extension for readers. So it's a great organization, and we definitely appreciate it.
You're welcome. And listen, it's a great pleasure. One of the huge perks of doing this stuff is the real opportunity, the impetus to meet and be introduced to fascinating people. And, you are certainly one of them. So I'm as or more excited than you are for this opportunity. So I thank you.
Well, and Sean, you mentioned about the stories that I have, and as you said, the Conversations with Us project. Part of it was gathering stories, stories and perspectives, and so, a lot of, and I know you've looked at the books, and so much of the books are, I really try to get out of the way is kind of my goal, and bring everyday American stories and really their perspectives to readers who aren't able to get out and do what I was able to do. I did. It was certainly a feat, but I didn't do all the 16,000 miles at once. I did several tours. I broke the U.S. into different regions. And so I've been through 49 states. And my last state is Hawaii, which I will do at some point soon, I hope. And so each region was usually a few states, and about 6 weeks on the road, around 1,900 to 2,000 miles each time. And then I would come home, fix all the stuff on my bike that broke, and replace all the stuff I lost, and try to put some weight back on, and kind of get my head back into normal life again, and then take down notes, do whatever I had to do to get my everyday life back in order. And then I would head out again on the next route. And I did that over the course of about 3 years, and that's what it took me to do 49 states.
Amazing. So, I think everyone would want to know that's watching and listening, probably with jaws dropped. Talk about how this project came together, you know, in terms of going from an idea to a reality, but also I think it's important, for better or worse, to talk about your background. I mean, were you a biker, or, you know, was this something that was a lifelong goal, or did you surprise yourself by this desire, this need to really get out there? I mean, we talk about doing road work, but I mean, you did the road work.
Yeah, it's funny, Sean. I think about that sometimes too. And certainly this, the idea of doing this was not an idea that I'd had for a long time before I did it. And but if you look back, sometimes I think we construct our stories in reverse. We take a given point in our lives, and then we look back and say, how did we come to be here? And that story kind of goes forward from, it actually goes backwards, although we tell it forwards. You know, I don't particularly know how everything came together. I know that I've always liked cycling. I mean, I always felt comfortable cycling. I guess I've done a lot of solo travel. I've backpacked through South America, done a lot of, on my own. So that was, I felt comfortable doing that. And I've always kind of, I guess, sought the truth. I've always sought like the real answer behind what people are saying. What's really happening here? What's really going on here? And I was also aware, frankly, of my ignorance. And I don't say that in a bad way. I mean that in the kind of the neutral ways. I just didn't know much about the country. And I would hear people on TV say things that, you know, Americans want this, or, you know, Americans think this, whatever. And then we have, of course, we all know of our competing cable news channels. And I would get totally different narratives from both of those. And I had no way of knowing who was right. I mean, I know generally what I felt was right, but, you know, I think back a long time ago to the spotted owl controversy, and I'm generally, I like wildlife. I think endangered species should be protected, but I had never in my life talked to someone whose livelihood had been, would be, or had been affected by that owl being placed on the endangered species list. And I thought, how can I really make a decision on something like this without knowing the full story, or, you know, as close to the full story as I can get? And so I guess all that stuff kind of came together. I had graduated law school in 2009 when the economy was sort of like it is now. It was very uncertain, very uncertain time. And really that was an opportunity for me to be able to do, you know, anything I wanted to do. I wasn't walking away from a cush law firm job because there weren't many out there. And that was an opportunity for me to be creative. And I think all of that sort of came together. And I said, you know what, I'm just going to get out there and ride my bike and talk to people. And the project evolved over time. But from the point I made that decision to the point I was pedaling was only, I would say, maybe 9 months or so. It was a pretty quick turnaround. And I'm so glad I did it. When I first started, I didn't think that anyone would want to really talk to me. I thought it would be sort of maybe a book about just me and the things I observed. And then I realized, first of all, that would be boring. And second of all, it wouldn't necessarily be credible because people aren't interested in me, and I have all the kinds of biases that we all have. They would want to hear directly from folks and see their face and see their picture and see their name. And I learned as I went through my first tour that people were entirely willing to talk to me, have their name in the book, have their picture next to their opinions. And that was probably the biggest surprise of all. And I was so happy for it, because now when you pick up the book, you will see, everyone you hear from, you will see their picture and you will know what town they're from, you know, what their name is. And it lets you see that these are real folks and what they're saying is, you know, really what they think.
Mm-hmm. Well, what about, so you talked about your background, which is very, you know, useful in terms of framing kind of your narrative. What about your writing background? And at what point did you have a desire to kind of unpack some of these, you know, because I think it's trite, but very true to observe that this book would be relevant 10 years ago, 20 years ago, but it's fair to say, and I'm happy to say, that this is particularly important and useful and helpful right now, where the only thing we agree on is that everyone doesn't agree with each other. But in terms of your own perspective that you brought to bear, or were there a series of things that made you realize that there was a book here and that that's the best way that you could explore and preserve some of these conversations?
Well, it sort of goes back to what I was saying earlier, is that I was just aware that I really didn't have a clue as to what was really going on in the lives of different kinds of people. And I also knew that, you know, I'm a young white guy with no health problems. And, you know, I had worked as a lawyer for a year and saved up some money. when I first started the project, and then I worked some more and continued with the project. But I was in about as best a position as anyone on earth could be to get out there and see the truth, seek the truth, and hope to find it. And there's so many people who might be just as curious as I am, but just would never have that opportunity. So I sort of felt like it was incumbent on me to do it. As far as writing goes, you know, I think I cut my teeth mostly writing as a lawyer, because I wrote prose for federal court, and I think my writing style is, especially in the first book, reflects that. I'm a bit rigid. I try to be clear and concise, and I think sometimes at the expense of I would, embellishment or flowery language. And I think the second book, which I just released a couple of months ago, is an improvement on that. I certainly hope it is.
Yeah, and you mentioned the. I think what you tap into, which is really helpful as inspiration for writers and adventurers, everywhere, is the two things. Whether it's writing or doing something like you did, or even just riding a bike or writing anything, is you have to do it, right? I mean, it's not profound, but it's the most profoundly simple truth is you can't do it unless you do it. So it is to your credit. I appreciate your humility about your personal circumstances, but I think a lot of people, given the druthers of undertaking an adventure like that, with the myriad difficulties I'm sure you faced, not a lot of people would have the fortitude to A, do that in the first place, and B, be as generous with their time and the willingness to tell stories, but then also just to put in that road work, and be boots on the ground.
I appreciate that, Sean. I tell you, you mentioned simplicity, and I think that's part of the project too, is that it's really founded on one of the simplest ideas that I can think of, is just, if you are wondering what's going on in the country, get out there and just find out. And again, I don't say that flippantly. I know a lot of people can't do that, aren't in the situation to do that. But I mean, that's what the project was. It was just getting out and talking to people. Getting out there on the road and riding the bike, it was fun. It was hard, and I worked hard to make sure my data was, logged, and I wasn't losing interviews, and I wasn't, losing map data. But I tell you that the real challenge and the real work is what's happening right now, which is writing the books and publishing them. And that, when I first started the project, I thought riding my bike and trying to talk to people every day was going to be hard. When I finished that, I thought, okay, writing these books is going to be hard. Right. When I finished that, I realized that marketing the books is the hard part, and getting the word out. We're inundated with information and well-funded campaigns, and it's just little old me. You're aware of my publishing company, Spoken Word Books. I founded that myself in Charlottesville, Virginia, and I decided that these books. Some listeners are going to know, and some viewers are going to know, that the traditional route for seeking publication is for authors is to find what's called a literary agent. And a literary agent is a person who's well connected in the publishing industry, and who they take you on as a client, and then they use their connections among publishers to then hopefully get your book into that publisher's domain. And it used to be that, and it still is impossible almost for an individual author to go straight to a publisher without an agent. Now we have self-publishing. And I originally wanted to traditionally publish, but I found that there was no agent willing to take a bet on a person that wants to produce an 8-volume series with almost 400 interviews, an unknown author. And they wanted me to cut it down, to the most interesting. And I just refused to do that. And so it was very easy for me, once I realized they weren't going to take my idea, to walk away from that and decide I was going to do this myself and form my own publishing company and go my own way.
Well, and I think, that we could, and at some point should have a very lengthy discussion or a follow-up that really dives into kind of the myriad implications of what you just talked about. I know personally, my background as a tech writer and an analyst, really studying how the music industry evolved, and on the heels of that, the publishing industry. And I think I say it often, but the simple kind of reality is that right now is a great time to be trying to get content out there, because there's never been more ease in terms of the barriers of entry. But because that's true for everyone, whether that's blogs or magazines or just the plethora of online content, it's never been more difficult to find an audience. But I think what you recognize and what you're articulating, there's a million, I think, bad reasons that are made a major publisher wouldn't take a chance on such a positive and obviously meaningful project. That being said, they're hanging, a lot of them are hanging by a thread, and the impetus for publication is just going to help cover our bills. So I know I've talked to a lot of agents over the years, some of whom have turned me down and said things along the lines of, if I could choose what I personally wanted to represent, my list would look a lot different than what it is. But I've always understood that they also, have skin in the game, because if the books don't sell, they don't get paid. But it speaks to, there's a certain rot in the industry, because the industry bemoans self-publishing and Amazon, but they're not taking a lot of chances, and they're putting a lot of reality TV star memoirs out into the discourse that I don't think the world necessarily is clamoring for. So props to you for the whole cycle, right? The idea, the execution, the writing, and then the marketing and the publishing, which is, I know from personal experience, is no mean feat.
I appreciate that. I think, Sean, what got me through, some really tough days on the road, is the same thing that got these books into people's hands, which is my stubbornness. I just refuse to, let a publisher tell me how to do it. I wanted a high quality book. I'm an unknown author, and I felt like if people were going to pay money, they deserve the best quality that I can do. And so, this is the second book. It's called American Southwest. It's got what's called a flexi-bound cover, which is kind of a cross between a hardcover and a soft cover. Yep. It's got inside cover printing with big maps. It's got, there's a big collage in the back. Amazing. Full color photos. And for a printer to print the book just like this, which is, I love it. I love the format. I think it's it's as good as it can be in my mind.
Yep.
And for a printer to print this, it would cost on the retail, on the shelf, maybe $30 or so. And, I essentially cut out the middleman, did it myself, and it's $22, which is still not a cheap book. Yep. But the point being that I was refused to see, they were going to say, well, we can't do color photos. It's too expensive. Right. We have to do a paperback. It's too, I just couldn't do it. And so I did it myself. I'm glad I did. It's really hard. And I'm still learning, but I don't regret it.
No. And I think for people that aren't quite aware of this, and I'll concede, I am by no means an expert on the publishing industry or the history, but I'm not unfamiliar with a lot of the different facets. I think it's important for people that don't know to understand that one of the issues has traditionally always been, and where the expression pulp comes from, is this notion of, certainly back in the day before print on demand, a publisher had to invest and print a certain amount of what they call a first run. So of course, inevitably, if a large percentage of those books don't sell, they get returned and turned into pulp. One of the beautiful things about print on demand technology, right, is that not only does it enable independent voices to find an audience that was otherwise unavailable, but it's environmentally friendly, because you don't have trees dying for unread books. Someone has to purchase the book in order for that the printing press to crank into gear. So there's a self-sustaining element of that. But personally, what I think the biggest selling point is what you just articulated, which is it gives the author the opportunity to let their vision be as unfettered as possible. And I think that means a better experience for the end user as well as the author.
Well, so I definitely appreciate everything you just said, and not to get too far in the weeds here, but these actually aren't print on demand. These were, because you can't do the.
Oh, I beg your pardon. Okay. Enlighten me.
Yeah, so I am a traditional publisher. I had to make big runs and, get them shipped in on a pallet. And they're stacked in boxes, and I've got a distributor and all that stuff. And it's been an experience. I don't know if your viewers are so interested in that, but happy to talk to them and you about that in the future. But I believe in this book, and I know that Americans want to understand what's happening in their country. And so I know that once, as far as if I can get the word out about Conversations with Us, the books will continue to sell. And I'm actually selling them on my website right now. You can get one of the books on Amazon, but Amazon and you can get the audiobook of the first one on Amazon. You can get both ebooks on Amazon. I like print books. Ebooks are great. The ebooks are really cool because I've gone in and embedded them. They're pilfered with hyperlinks. So you can, all of my pictures didn't make it into the book. And so you can see something, you can maybe hear me talking about the road noise on Highway 220 and click a link and hear that road noise. You can see videos. It's really, the ebook experience is really cool. I took a lot of time with it and really tried to bring the multimedia out with the ebooks. That said, of course, holding a print book is cool too. And any book that's ordered off of my website, I sign autograph before I mail. So that's another benefit to ordering from Spoken Word Books directly instead of Jeff Bezos. Of course, Amazon, I do order things off of Amazon now and then, and so I'm not knocking it too much.
No, and listen, I apologize for the presumption, and I definitely was speaking more broadly about what that technology, but that being said, that only augments my appreciation and awe of the work you've done, because you really truly made an investment literally on yourself and your book. So that actually speaks volumes. My point, if I had one, was really talking about kind of the ease for any author, whomever they are, to kind of get into the game.
Right.
Then there's myriad concerns and considerations about what the quality looks like and the necessity of having an editor and a graphic designer. But it sounds like you really handled virtually all aspects of this, which is a whole other category. And again, as someone that's been in both worlds, that's very impressive. And I can also pitch, Chris will be appearing at our upcoming literary festival, and has a panel where there'll be a little bit of a deeper dive into the kind of the contemporary publishing scene and an opportunity to discuss some of these experiences and get even deeper into the weeds, which I think some people really want to do.
Well, John, I am writing a thriller right now, a fiction thriller that will be print on demand, as you say, because it's perfect for print on demand. And I'm kind of excited about it. I'm in several I'm in 2 writing critique groups, and right after our interview, I'm going to be presenting one of my chapters to that critique group. So that's exciting.
You hear that, listeners? The work never ends, but that's a good thing. Well, speaking of the weeds, though, so I mean, I've got a zillion questions, but I would love to hear you read a little bit from your book, but maybe to tee that up, I think an obvious question that anyone would have, and I know I have had throughout diving into your books, there have to have been some very memorable experiences for both good and bad, and perhaps you'd care to share either some genuine highlights or some lowlights or something that surprised you. Enlighten us with some behind the scenes.
Well, let's see that. So my first tour was through the Deep South, and that was several years ago. And I didn't know if I was going to continue with the project after that. And I got a call about a really good job offer at a law firm in Houston. And so I put the project on hold, moved, and I go through this in the introduction to the first book, moved to Houston and worked litigation for 4 or 5 years. And then I decided, it was now or never, and quit the firm and began with the project again. And because the Conversations with Us project, because they were 5 years separating my second bike ride from my first, and then every subsequent tour was close in time to the second. I actually start the series with the second tour. And then I will, at the end of the project, I'm going to hop on my motorcycle and retrace my first route. And there'll be 10 years between the 2 tours. And it'll be sort of what's changed and what hasn't about the Deep South and maybe the country in general. But, I remember during that first tour, I remember several events. I remember meeting a man named Rick, first Cajun man I'd ever met, right on the Mississippi, Louisiana border. And I saw a bicycle outside of a little fish restaurant, and I went in, and Rick was in there. And Rick he had been in Desert Storm and had stepped on a mine and lost a leg and an arm. And he had prosthetics on both. And he was sweeping up cigarette butts out of this parking lot for his dinner. and he had 2 fishing rods on his bicycle and a little mounted like that. And he had the best attitude of anyone I've ever met. And he was a hunting guide and a fishing guide, and I thought, and he had, by the way, the best accent on earth. The Cajun, it was just a great accent. I'd never heard it in person before. And I just, it's just one of the many times I've thought, if this person can do what they're doing, I really need to, when I'm feeling down on myself or when I'm feeling, like I can't do something that I want to do or the world's against me, I really need to evaluate and think about the people who are facing much tougher obstacles than I am. And that was that was just right off the bat comes to mind when you asked that question. That was certainly probably a transformative moment for me. And I think most of us have had that experience where we've met someone who's really, got a much better attitude than we have at that moment, but are also simultaneously facing much tougher obstacles.
And I would venture to say that experience that you just described is kind of the whole project's heart and soul in a microcosm of what you hope to experience, and having your own previous conceptions disabused, but also having the opportunity then to share that, and that can be contagious. Talk a little bit about, what did you have an MO in terms of how did you decide A, where to stop, and B, who you talk to, and then how did you have a similar process for initiating these conversations? And maybe walk us through a case study of how this actually played out. Sure.
So I think, Sean, the romantic notion is that someone just hops on a bike and rides into the sunset,
right?
And everything just kind of, and there are people who do that. But because I was trying to be systematic about meeting people, sitting down for and by the way, I hit my finger with a hammer, and so that's what this little black spot is right here. And so, I did, to sit down and talk with someone for probably on average 45 minutes takes work every single day, especially when I might not smell that good. I just come out of the Wild Blue Yonder on a bicycle. And so to ensure that, but I wanted to get that, so I would pedal 50 miles a day and interview one person every day was my goal. Now, some days I would pedal less, some days I'd pedal more, some days I wouldn't interview anyone, some days I'd interview 2 people. Mm-hmm. But my general goal is because I wanted to that was my best way of sort of randomizing and getting a broad survey of the region. Now, I knew it couldn't be totally random. For instance, the first book, I interviewed probably 3 or 4 teachers. And I think the reason that was happening is because I was touring in the summer. And so teachers were off work. Sure. And also in the Midwest, I didn't interview many people of color. And there's a reason for that. I'm sure part of that reason is I didn't try hard enough. But the main reason I think is there just aren't many compared to other places in the country, especially not geographically spread out. And it's just mostly white folks. And so, one of the things that I try to keep in mind, and I hope my readers can keep in mind, is that I think sometimes I get asked, did you interview a diverse group of people? Did you try to? And I think we just need to make sure we're careful about and deliberate about the way we use the word diversity. I interviewed a lot of people who were a lot different than each other, even though I might have 10 people who are all white.
Sure.
Very different life experiences, old timers, 4th generations, someone who moved there because something's going wrong back home. I interviewed a drug addict, a white guy at a bus stop in Detroit, and very different life experiences. So I just, I kept in mind, and I would just urge folks to keep in mind when reading my books that you may see some faces that kind of look the same, but I think when you read their stories, you'll see that things are different. But back to kind of answer your question. So I knew that I didn't want to have to spend an hour a day looking for a place to sleep. And so, I did sometimes, but it was much nicer if I knew that if I pedaled 60 miles that way, there would be a place to sleep waiting for me, whether it was someone like on couchsurfing.com or warmshowers.com, which is a website like couchsurfing, but for the cyclotourist community. I would like to set those up ahead of time because I knew that I could focus on observing, talking, and have no more mental energy invested that day in trying to find a place to sleep. Now, there were times like in Alaska where it didn't matter because I could just pull off on the side of the road anywhere I wanted and sleep. So I didn't have to worry about it that much. And that's what I did in Alaska. But there aren't many places in the States that you can do that and be comfortable, especially traveling alone. I mean, I've done it. You can hide somewhere behind, a barn and do it. But, I was trying to meet people and talk to people, and that was the primary crux of goal of what I was doing. And so, trying to sneak behind to the woods somewhere wasn't the best way to meet people, to sleep. So I would call ahead with warm showers. Sometimes I would stay in motels, hotels. I would camp. Small towns a lot. I would call up the police station and say, "Hey, look, I just arrived in town. There's a really nice gazebo in your park. Do you mind if I sleep there? I'll be gone in the morning. I won't make a mess." And they'd always say yes. Or I'd call up, I'd see like a sign, like your pastor is whatever on the church, and I'd call the number and say, "This is, you mind if I sleep behind your church?" I had a pastor invite me into his house one time after letting me saying yes, which we chatted with his family for a while. So finding a place to sleep so the stops were planned out ahead of time. I didn't always make the stops,
Right.
but I tried, because if I missed, I would set up interviews ahead of time sometimes too. And so if I missed 12 miles one day, 12 miles takes a long time to make up on a 100-pound bicycle. And so then I might not make the interview 3 days down the road. It would accumulate. So I'd always try to make that destination. But if I didn't, it wasn't the end of the world. I would set up some interviews ahead of time. I would browse Google, and I would see like a given town. I'm just thinking right now, day 33 of American Southwest, I interviewed the president of the Kingman, Arizona Astronomy Club. And how did I find him? I went on Google. I knew I would be in Kingman in 2 weeks or whatever. And then I just looked at the search results. And the first thing that caught my attention was the Astronomy Club. And so then I just contacted them and said, "Hey, I'd like to interview. Here's my website." And then people would almost always say yes. Now, there's lots of random interviews. I would meet someone on a park bench. Sometimes I would pull into a town and go to the Chamber of Commerce and say, "Hey, do you guys know of anyone in town that I could interview?" Or I would talk to the ladies at the diners, who would fill up my coffee, and they would say, "Oh yeah, I'll make a phone call." And then they would make a phone call and someone would come to meet me, or at bars in the evening. So I would say probably a third to a half of my interviews were random, and the other half were either directly set up by me or set up through someone I would meet, like on Couchsurfing or something like that.
So what were some of the biggest challenges? I mean, you kind of just touched on that, but in terms of, the logistics, I have to imagine with a project like this, and again, you just articulated it very well, but there's that combination of, you have to leave room for spontaneity, you
Sure.
have to be open to epiphanies, but of course, it would probably be a lot longer, more expensive, and frustrating if you just set out without any kind of plan. But what were some of the things you found most challenging? Because it does sound like, with some forethought, finding places to sleep was surprisingly painless, and people were willing to talk, which I wouldn't have necessarily guessed. When you say it, and actually, I think some of that you should give yourself credit too, right? The way you're engaging and clearly honest, and what your project is might take down some barriers. But I guess I would have thought there might have been more resistance, or you would just had a harder time finding that right person to connect with and chat with.
I did. I totally expected to get resistance, which is why when I first set out, like I said, I initially planned on just writing, "I met a man. This is what he looked like. He was in his 50s, and this is what he said." Or actually in the books are profiles of people now, and it's a lot different. And it surprised me. I think people were just really wanted to tell their story, and it's kind of fascinating for me. I felt like my cycling clothes and my cycling gloves were some kind of superhero, superpower outfit, because just regular old Chris Register out here, sitting on a bar stool, it's not that easy for me to engage with someone I disagree with. I suffer from all the, I get upset sometimes. I suffer from all the problems I think all of us do when we're trying to have a discussion with someone. But on the bike, I could do it, and I would have people who I vehemently disagree with, and I would tell them so sometimes. But it was almost never uncomfortable. I mean, almost never. There was a bar or a cafe in Eastern Kentucky, Louisa, Kentucky, and that was one of the only times I was just talking with random people there, and everyone in the whole place got mad at me because we were talking about climate change and coal and things like that, but that was really one of the only times it ever happened. And I think they looked at me as like, okay, this guy's just trying to, understand me, and I respect that, and so I'll debate with him and talk with him, and even if he questions me, it's okay, because I had a guy in, I think it was day 9 in American Southwest, a pig farmer named Doug Schaefer. he's a conservative Christian, white guy. And we started talking about Muslims and how, he felt like it was unfair that he couldn't say, his high school couldn't say the Lord's Prayer before a football game because of, other folks coming in, Muslims and everything like that. And I asked him, had you ever heard a Muslim prayer at a football game? And he said, well, no, I haven't. And I said, well, I don't have many Muslim friends. I know a few, and most of the ones I know are really conservative, family-oriented people, kind of like you are. And I said, have you ever sat down to talk with one? And he said, well, you know what? I don't think I even know a Muslim. And he said, so maybe I don't know as much as, I think I do, basically. And it was really neat to see that process. Now, I'm not here to say he was wrong, anything, but just to see his being open to my suggestions was neat. And he certainly was listening to what I was saying as I was listening to him.
Right. That's fantastic. I'm curious if you'd care to share some personal, doesn't have to be anything heavy, but some personal beliefs or thoughts or preconceptions that you kind of had shifted during the course of your travels.
Yeah, I think that it's made me a little bit of a annoying person to talk to now because I tend to see a lot of different sides. And I sounds like I'm equivocating sometimes on things.
Mm-hmm.
I think about right now, obviously we're in a pivotal moment in the country's history. And I think about a lot of, in the second book, I talked to a lot of Native Americans and from different tribes because I was in the Southwest. And I think about one woman telling me, she said, Black folks, Hispanic folks sort of have a niche. Their concerns are known, if not always, they might not always be listened to, but they're known among, the greater population of the United States. But when's the last time you heard about a Native American issue? And I couldn't remember the last time I heard about a Native American issue. And I still can't remember, sitting here right now, think back to any recent news concerning Native American issues. And it's a big population of people who aren't heard from very much. And I became aware of that, and not only aware of that, but aware of the fact that I wasn't aware of it. I heard from a lot of conservative people. I went to Georgetown Law School, which is definitely more of a liberal law school. I was in the most liberal program of the school, which was a unique program. I don't consider myself liberal, but I tend to hang out with folks who are, and I think that I can see a lot more of the conservative side of things. Now, I think one of the most fundamental realizations I came to was that, if you are a person who considers yourself liberal and you don't really understand conservatives, just think that if you really think about it, it is your dream to be a conservative. And I don't mean litmus tests. I mean, it is your dream to be happy with the status quo. And I think that is the fundamental definition of a conservative, is more or less happy with the status quo, or maybe some, status quo that they think or did exist in the past. But if you ever consider yourself, I don't understand how this person thinks, then that is one way to think about it. And that's kind of one of the things I came to, because I interviewed a lot of conservative people, because again, geographical dispersion, the country is conservative.
Sure.
So, and I encountered a lot of those kinds of folks. I guess the other thing is that, again, going to college, I served in the Peace Corps. For me, public service is, you go across the ocean and you help, people, poor people, or people who are in some kind of crisis. And I had always viewed public service through NGOs or through the government. And I'd never really thought about the conservative mindset, which is public service through your local church, public service through local brownie sales, for someone who lost his job because he threw out his back or whatever. And so I didn't interview them. I stayed with a couple in North Carolina, and there were 10-year-old and 8-year-old kid over there at this couple's house. I said, why? They're neighbors. And I said, well, why are these kids over there doing their science project at your house? And they said, well, because their parents are deadbeats, and if we didn't help them, no one would. And they were some of the most conservative people I met, and they were jibing me about things. but I hadn't seen that before, and
Mhm.
that was, I guess, transformative as well.
Wow. Well, you bring up an interesting possibility of a question, which is, you talk uh, about, and I certainly agree, across different geographic areas. Frankly, even across similar geographic areas, you take a cross section of people, you're going to get a lot of different opinions. But you mentioned, which doesn't surprise me, you spoke to a lot of conservative or self-identified Christian conservatives. I'm curious, even amongst that demographic, how much of the geographic difference played in, or were you finding across the board that demographic has very similar views, or was that even kind of dependent on certain geographical areas and what their particular beliefs or concerns kind of revolved around? Like, I would imagine, just to give you an example where my head's at, I can totally appreciate where in Kentucky, coal is probably a very top of mind, where certainly in New Mexico, that's probably not going to be. But yes, did you notice any kind of, even within certain, or I guess what I'm also getting at is demographics that we tend, or on the news tend to say, this is the conservative view, this is the liberal view. I'm certainly aware in my own world that within those, there's very seldom universal accord.
Right. Yeah. And you see my eyes going up, Chunks. I'm thinking about your question. It's a big question, but the first thing that comes to mind, the very first interview in my second book, a man named Mike Lewis, he's a, he's a gun guy. He owned a gun store. One of the most colorful guys I interviewed. Is great fun to talk to. But he said that I almost want to read what he said, but he said that he had a gay friends who were getting married. He considered himself conservative. He says exactly what you just said. I don't think you can check off all these boxes or all those boxes. I think that's for the people on the news and that's not how real America works. And he said, I've got gay friends who are getting married, and I'm going to their wedding. And so that's obviously not in the conservative box if you buy, what you see on TV. So that's just one example. And there is, I met there aren't many of these left, but some of the old school Democrats. Most of those folks, when I say old school Democrat, I'm talking about, working class Democrat union people.
Right.
Most of those folks identify as Republican now.
Mm-hmm.
There are still, almost all of them have shifted to the Republican Party. But there's still a few old school working class Democrats that I talk to who, if you just talk to, they sound culturally conservative, but they still maintain this class consciousness of the working class or poor person, anti-capitalist, which used to be the differentiation between Democrat 40 years ago and Republican. A lot of that was do you wear a white shirt or a blue shirt? And that's not so much the case anymore. And that's been, I think, one of the fundamental shifts we've seen in the past 25 years
Sure.
Politically. But it was interesting for instance, there's a guy in the first book named Rick Beardsley. And I write about this, and I talked to him to his face about it. You seem like a really libertarian guy, and yet you're also decrying, the wealthy class. He was a very class conscious guy. And you're also, you say you're a Democrat, but you sound like a Republican, a modern Republican, in terms of your libertarianism. And I could never quite reconcile his libertarianism with his essentially wanting to cap salaries of management. And I asked him about that. He said, well, he kind of equivocated. And I don't think, and there are a lot of things I don't have resolved. I'm not saying anything negative about him, but I don't think he had quite, reconciled the two notions.
Right.
And that was just interesting to see.
Well, I guess I would be obliged to say, because I didn't specifically signal out, the conservative demographic, but similarly, did you find shifts of opinion, in the so-called liberal, whether you were in, closer to the East Coast or middle country or closer to out West, anything that stood out in terms of, interesting, these people on paper are all in the same tribe or group, but within different areas, there's some radically different views.
Yeah, I would have to think about that one, because there's nothing that comes to mind. I got my eyes up. I'm thinking, I guess that's what I brought up Rick for.
Yeah.
he's a Democrat, but he
Right.
sounds Republican, or he sounds conservative, I should say.
Mm-hmm.
That was kind of, again, that dichotomy between what my expectations and what his voter registration card would say.
Sure. So here's a topical question. It's certainly not a pleasant consideration, but the reason we're having this interview on Zoom right now is because of the COVID, crisis. That depending on the day, we're confident that we're making progress, or perhaps we're not anywhere close. But how is that going to impact the future of this project, at least short term?
Well, I can tell you, Sean, that my second book, American Southwest, was set to be released on March the 19th, and there were no events surrounding that, and so that was really unfortunate. But again, I mean, that's been one of my biggest problems, and there are a lot of people out there with a lot more problems because of the coronavirus and not being able to advertise their book. But it did let me down. My cycling, except for Hawaii, is done, and so really, as a writer, and I can sit down and hunker down at my computer and write, and not really be affected so much in terms of producing the books. Now, as far as promoting them and getting out and talking with people about them, I can't do that yet. Although there is an event at Horton Vineyards, I believe it's the 11th of July. Right now, it's still on. Horton has been very supportive. Shannon Horton, the owner, loves the books, and she's having her tasting room open. People are wearing masks, I guess, except for when they're actually tasting the wine. Mm-hmm. I will be there unless something gets called off on July the 11th. But what I've found, Sean, is that when I'm just not very good at social media. It's just not my thing. But when I go out and go to book festivals and have my bike, the touring rig next to me, I talk nonstop from 4, 5, 6 hours straight. I don't sit down, and folks are interested. I sell more books than anyone else at the festival. Sometimes it's happened. People like the books. They like the ideas. I like talking to folks. I like answering their questions. I like when they ask me a question I hadn't thought about. It makes me think more. Mm-hmm. So I wish I could do more of that. And unfortunately, that's not going to be possible for probably several months to come.
Sure. But I guess the silver lining for you is that, like you just said, you've already done most of the data collecting. Right. So I guess I was thinking, if you had a lot more data to collect, the whole, prospect of how you'd be approaching people would be radically, if it not only changed, but maybe impossible.
Brought to a stop. I've thought about that. What would have happened if this had happened while I was halfway through a tour? I'd have to pack up and go home. Mm-hmm. I mean, you just couldn't do it.
Right. Well, one of the features of this series is we always hope that an author will read from their book. I would love it. I'm sure people paying attention would love to hear a passage or two that you would like to share if you're up for it.
Sure. Yeah, I think I can read the prologue. It's short, and it sort of summarizes the project, Sean. And then, if we have time and if we want, I told you I don't interview. There were several days when I wouldn't find anyone to interview, and so but I would still. So the book is one chapter is one day on tour, mm-hmm. And so, for instance, the second book, American Southwest, has I think 39 chapters because there were 39 days that I was on the road, and so even a day that I didn't interview someone, I would still write, at least a page or two. Let you know what happened that day, because sometimes I would meet folks, and if we want, I can read. I have a 2-page chapter that happened on day 15 when I took a rest day, and that was interesting. But I'll read the preface right now. It says, America is a landscape shaped by journeys. The first North Americans likely walked here from Asia, whether hot on the trail of a woolly mammoth herd or merely enamored with the beauty of the rising sun, we will never know. Thousands of years later, new faces arrived from across oceans. Many pursued dreams, I think, familiar to us all: opportunity, freedom, community, peace. Others mounted a desperate last-ditch attempt to escape poverty, famine, war, the church, or the sheriff. Some disembarked in chains, forced ashore by those driven here by greed. A few, pining for adventure, just rolled the dice. From this foundation of human nature arose the United States of America, a nation shaped by ideals. I can scarce imagine an endeavor to equal the bold optimism so powerfully expressed on the eve of our birth. In truth, we have never perfectly honored the soaring faith in human potential and dignity enshrined in our founding documents. Nevertheless, I see the notion of America continuing to guide us while inspiring the world. Perhaps this is because we are still viewed as the place where ambition and ability matter more than pedigree. Or perhaps our formative values simply reflect the breadth of human learning set forth on parchment. The ink has long since dried. Approaching 250 years old, what began as a framework of ideals has matured into a forum for ideas on how best to manifest those aspirations. We have emerged from a loose confederation of newcomers to become a people with a shared history and, most importantly, a shared future. Our collective journey continues. America is and always will be a work in progress. Where we come from is instructive, where we stand is unclear, where we choose to go is paramount. Conversations with Us is the story of my own journey into America to explore all of these, and my mission to share with you what I have learned. I'm glad to have your company along the way. That's the prologue.
So yeah, I can't imagine anyone hearing that isn't already sufficiently intrigued, not now wanting to dive right in, but we do have time, and I'd love you to share the other section that you mentioned.
Sure. So what I did at the beginning of each chapter, Sean, was you'll see, I just hold this up here. I flagged it in case you wanted to read it. This is going to be not a great way of showing you, but it's day 15. And I have a little heading at the beginning of each chapter. And you can see the map right there that shows my progress that day. And of course, that black line grows longer each chapter.
Sure.
And then I would title the chapter with something from that day. And so each chapter title is unique. And you'll see how many miles I pedaled. That was an off bike day, so I didn't pedal any miles. So the title of this chapter is No Peace at Rest. Neglected tasks consumed my quote-unquote rest day at Cloudcroft Hostel. And this was in Cloudcroft, New Mexico, which is I think it was about 8,000 feet elevation. It was a fascinating place to be after being in the desert for 2 weeks. So neglected tasks consumed my rest day at Cloudcroft Hostel, extracting thorns and other threads embedded in my pal's tires before they pushed through to the inner tube, tightening loose fasteners and replacing lost ones, adjusting the brakes after 800 miles of wear, toothbrushing and lubricating the pedal clips and chain, washing clothes, cleaning under my fingernails, backing up digital data to the cloud in case my phone later tumbled into a ravine, shaving, sending emails to potential interviewees and overnight hosts for the coming days, tending to the bike's finicky leather saddle, using a washcloth in the shower, airing out the tent and sleeping bag, and scraping away congealed sunblock from my sunglasses, mud and sand from my shoe pleats, and sweat salt grime from my helmet straps. Calling mom. I also set aside time for what I probably neglected most while on tour, relaxing. Out on the hostel's front porch, an hour or so before dusk, a reclining wooden chair hugged my bottom while a handrail supported my feet. The mountainous evergreen forest, shifting color in the waning light, held back tomorrow from my mind. I was wrapping up my harassment of a small scorpion, which had steadfastly refused several invitations to sting a twig, when a retirement-aged white woman named Janice joined me outside. She was the only other hotel guest I had seen. As she recounted stories from her decades as a Jehovah's Witness missionary, I got the sense Janice was now searching for some type of peace, some way to reconcile her innate restlessness with her dwindling time. It felt strange hearing her struggle over how best to spend her remaining healthy years, whether to settle down or just keep exploring. Actually, it felt sad. Janice's young wanderer's spirit resided in a body ambivalent to her dreams. She drove us down to a nearby convenience store that doubled as a restaurant. I remember a little of our conversation, there chatting lightly over paper plates and plastic forks before the store cashier butted in. A balding white man with a flannel shirt and circular-rimmed eyeglasses, he informed me that the 2008-2009 financial crisis would have been averted had America only maintained its course as a God-fearing country. I demurred, one thing led to another, and the man finally accused me of being one of those who believe in evolution. I guess because the calming touring rig was parked a couple of miles away, And since I had spent 2 weeks listening to others' thoughts without sharing many of my own, I lost my cool and reveled in it. Over the next few minutes, I deployed every weapon in my veritable arsenal to assail this man's worldview and reveal to him and anyone listening why he was New Mexico's foremost idiot, while he unleashed the same against me. Though a slice of my mind could see Janice across the table growing red with embarrassment and discomfort, I was too hot to care, my voice pounding the walls of the tiny store. Finally, the restaurant cook who had served supper to Janice before emerged from the kitchen with a growling admonishment for both me and the cashier. He was right to do so. I felt ashamed. Back at the hostel, Janice was forgiving in the most gracious kind of way, refusing to acknowledge I owed her an apology for my inconsiderate behavior. We stood together in the dark parking lot, admiring an ink-black sky transected by the ghostly Milky Way, the bugling of distant elk filling the void left by words unspoken.
Wow. Well, Chris, I think you've an hour is always at once not enough and can be too much. I think we have clearly established that there's so much more to talk about, but I think the best way to do that is for people to really experience what you experienced. And the best way to do that is to support the project and support true independent publishing by getting behind this and checking you out. And as by way of yet again a reminder and blurb, Chris will be appearing at our literary festival, taking a much deeper dive into the world of publishing. I greatly appreciate your time, and as a fellow writer and American, I sincerely appreciate your efforts to teach us a lot of things we're not going to learn on TV, and things that a lot of us, like I said earlier, even if we had the opportunity, I don't think many of us would have the courage or the stamina, not to mention the talent, to pull off what you did. So it's a tremendous service to the literary community, but way beyond that.
I appreciate that, Sean. And I definitely invite folks to visit my website. It's conversationswithus.com. And that's where they can order the books. And if you're interested in a publishing company as well, aside of it, you can visit spokewordbooks.com. And as you say, I'll be joining you in, let's see, it's July 18th, I believe. If folks are interested in hearing more about how to get published, I'll also be teaching an online course with Charlottesville's Writers House, which is an extended course like the one I'll be presenting with Libby McNamee at the Literary Festival. And that'll be August the 10th through 14th. And they can go to writerhouse.org. It's going to be an online course, and you can check that out. And I'll also be presenting for the Virginia Writers Club on August the 2nd. There's going to be a symposium, I think the 31st, July 31st to the 2nd, and it's going to be an online symposium. And I'll be presenting a course that you kind of alluded to in several questions, Sean. It's called Capture, Consolidate, Craft, and Connect. And so it's kind of the technical side of, if you have some adventure or some trip or something you're doing and you want to learn you want to write about it or blog about it, how can you, from the get-go, make sure that you capture that data, consolidate it, and then you craft whatever it is you want to craft, and then you connect with your listeners or readers. And it's going to be kind of how, based on what I've done, how to do that. So that might be interesting for folks.
That's great. A lot of good resources there. And I'll make sure that I embed links to all this information when we put this on the 1455 site. So like I said, folks, check out Chris, support his work, and we'll look forward to seeing you at our next interview. Chris, thank you again for sharing time with us. And just thank you for being you. I look forward to hearing and reading more.
Thank you, Sean. And thanks, 1455. See you soon.
All right. Take care.
All right.